Victoria Hale had spent her entire life building walls high enough that nobody could ever hurt her again. At 36, she was the feared CEO of one of the most powerful cybersecurity corporations in Chicago, a woman whose cold stare could silence an entire boardroom and whose signature could destroy careers overnight. People respected her money, her intelligence, and her ruthless control. But nobody truly knew her. Because behind the designer suits, billion-dollar deals, and luxury penthouse overlooking the frozen skyline, Victoria lived completely alone. Every relationship in her life had eventually become transactional, every smile hiding an agenda, every promise ending in betrayal. So when a violent winter storm struck downtown Chicago the same night her company suffered a disastrous internal collapse, Victoria believed it was simply another battle she needed to survive. She had no idea her entire life was about to change because of the last man she would have ever noticed. The transformer explosion happened just after midnight. One moment, the upper floors of her luxury building glowed with warm golden light, and the next, the entire tower shook beneath a deafening blast that shattered windows and sent terrified residents flooding into the icy streets below. Smoke filled the corridors. Emergency alarms screamed through the darkness. Victoria stood outside beneath freezing rain wearing a $1,000 coat over bare feet. Watching firefighters seal off the penthouse she had once believed was untouchable. Hotels across the city were already overwhelmed due to the storm evacuation, and for the first time in years, the powerful Victoria Hale had nowhere to go. That was when the building manager hesitantly mentioned a temporary solution. A small guest house behind a duplex on the edge of the city, owned by a night security guard from Victoria's own company. The humiliation alone made her want to refuse immediately. But exhaustion finally defeated pride. 20 minutes later, a black SUV pulled up outside a modest, snow-covered home glowing softly beneath old porch lights. Victoria stepped out, expecting discomfort, awkward silence. Maybe even desperation from a man suddenly housing a billionaire CEO. Instead, Ethan Brooks barely reacted at all. Tall, quiet, wearing a faded gray sweater after finishing his overnight shift, he simply opened the door and calmly said, "It's cold outside. Your room's already warm." No excitement, no nervousness, no attempt to impress her. And somehow, that unsettled Victoria more than anything else. Then she noticed the little girl asleep on the couch beneath a handmade blanket crayons scattered across the coffee table beside half-finished homework, the smell of homemade soup still lingering in the kitchen, and something inside that tiny home that had been missing from Victoria's world for years. Peace. But later that night, unable to sleep, Victoria walked past the guest room hallway and froze. Inside Ethan's office, hidden behind the life of an ordinary security guard, 6 monitors glowed with classified-level cyberattack maps, encrypted intelligence reports, and security systems so advanced even her senior executives would not understand them. Ethan sat alone in the dark, staring at the screens with an expression that sent chills down her spine. Cold. Focused. Dangerous. In that moment, Victoria realized one terrifying thing. The quiet, single father she had been forced to live with was not who he pretended to be. Victoria Hale barely slept that first night inside Ethan Brooks' home. Every sound felt foreign to her. The quiet hum of the heater, the soft creak of old wooden floors, the distant wind rattling the kitchen window above the sink. None of it resembled the silent perfection of her penthouse, where every surface gleamed like glass, and every room felt more like a showroom than a place someone actually lived. Here, life existed in small, imperfect details. Children's drawings hung crookedly on the refrigerator with colorful magnets. Tiny sneakers rested near the front door beside Ethan's worn black work boots. A stack of unpaid bills sat neatly tucked under a bowl of fruit on the counter. Victoria lay awake, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, unable to understand why the modest little guest room made her feel strangely exposed. It wasn't because the place was uncomfortable. In fact, Ethan had somehow prepared everything before she arrived. Fresh towels folded on the bed, warm tea left beside the lamp. even a space heater quietly glowing near the corner because he had noticed she was shivering earlier without her saying a word. That unsettled her more than neglect would have. Rich people were usually surrounded by service, but never by genuine thoughtfulness. By morning, Victoria had already convinced herself this arrangement would only last a few days, long enough for repairs on her building, long enough to survive the storm. Then she would return to her world and forget this strange little house existed. But when she stepped into the kitchen at 6 in the morning wearing an expensive cream-colored sweater and carrying her phone like armor, she stopped in surprise. Ethan was already awake preparing breakfast while helping Lily finish a school project at the same time. The kitchen smelled like coffee, cinnamon, and toasted bread. Lily sat at the table surrounded by colored paper and markers, while Ethan calmly flipped pancakes with one hand and corrected her spelling with the other. "You forgot the second R in tomorrow," he said quietly. "That word's stupid," Lily mumbled. "It has too many letters." Ethan almost smiled. "Still gotta spell it right." Victoria stood there awkwardly for several seconds before Lily noticed her. "Good morning," the little girl chirped brightly. "Dad made extra pancakes because he said rich people probably don't eat enough real food." Victoria blinked slowly. Ethan didn't even look embarrassed. "I said executives usually skip breakfast," he corrected calmly while setting a plate down at the table. Victoria expected nervousness around her. People usually rush to impress her, apologize around her, flatter her. But Ethan treated her exactly the same way he treated everyone else. Calm, polite, unshaken. It irritated her almost immediately. She sat down carefully, glancing around the tiny kitchen. "You do this every morning?" she asked. "Mostly. And then you work overnight security?" "Mostly." His answers were short, but never rude. That almost made it worse. Victoria studied him carefully while pretending not to. Even in simple clothes, Ethan carried himself differently from other people. Straight posture, controlled movements, quiet awareness of everything around him. He moved through the room like someone trained to stay alert at all times. Yet somehow he still managed to make Lily laugh while packing her lunch. The contradiction bothered Victoria more than she wanted to admit. After breakfast, Ethan drove Lily to school before heading to the office for his daytime maintenance shift. Victoria remained behind temporarily, working remotely from the dining table, while her assistant coordinated damage control for both the penthouse and the company's worsening cybersecurity issue. By noon, her stress level had already exploded. 3 investors demanded emergency meetings. The media had discovered rumors about internal security failures. Damian Cross called twice asking when she planned to return to headquarters. Victoria snapped at everyone. Yet somehow the tiny house remained calm around her chaos. When Ethan returned briefly in the afternoon to repair a leaking pipe beneath the sink, Victoria watched him silently from across the room. Most people rushed under pressure. Ethan never did. He simply rolled up his sleeves, fixed the pipe in 10 minutes, cleaned the water from the floor, and continued with his day as if nothing could disturb him. "You're very calm for someone juggling 2 jobs and a child," Victoria finally said coldly. Ethan tightened the wrench once more before answering. "Panicking usually makes problems worse. You always answer like that." "Like what?" "Like somebody who rehearsed every sentence beforehand." Ethan glanced at her for the first time in several minutes. His eyes were darker up close than she remembered, sharp, observant, but strangely tired beneath the surface. "No," he said quietly. "I answer like somebody who learned silence saves energy." The response lingered in Victoria's mind long after he walked away. That evening, she returned to headquarters for an emergency board meeting. The atmosphere inside the executive floor immediately reminded her why she hated people. Executives talked over each other. Investors demanded answers. Damian Cross leaned casually against the conference table, wearing his usual polished smile that never reached his eyes. "You disappeared at a very convenient time," he remarked smoothly when Victoria entered. "The city nearly collapsed in a snowstorm," Victoria replied coldly. "Not everyone has a helicopter." A few executives laughed nervously. Damian smirked. "I heard you've been staying with building staff." Victoria stiffened slightly. Temporary situation. Must be fascinating. His tone carried quiet mockery. Seeing how normal people live, Victoria ignored him and began the meeting. But throughout the next hour, her mind drifted unexpectedly toward Ethan. Specifically toward the monitors she had seen glowing inside his office the night before. She couldn't stop thinking about them. The encryption maps, the advanced attack simulations. Those were not systems a security guard casually studied after midnight. And yet Ethan had acted as though nothing unusual existed at all. Later that night, exhausted after another brutal meeting, Victoria returned to the duplex expecting silence. Instead, she found Lily asleep on the couch while Ethan sat beside her, reading a worn, hardcover novel under a dim lamp. The scene felt impossibly peaceful compared to the corporate battlefield Victoria had just escaped. Ethan looked up briefly. "Long day," he asked. "That obvious?" "You've checked your phone 19 times since walking through the door." Victoria frowned. "You counted?" "No," he replied calmly. "I notice patterns." Again that strange answer. She removed her heels slowly, suddenly aware of how loud and tense she felt inside this quiet room. "Most people become nervous around me," she admitted after a moment. Ethan turned a page in his book. "Most people are nervous around power. And you're not?" "Finally," he looked directly at her. "Should I be?" The question caught her off guard because he sounded genuinely curious rather than defiant. Victoria realized then that Ethan did not fear her authority because he somehow viewed it differently from everyone else. To him, power was not impressive. It was simply temporary, dangerous maybe, but never sacred. That realization unsettled her deeply. Over the next several days, the forced arrangement continued longer than expected because structural damage in Victoria's building proved more severe than originally reported. Every morning, she woke inside a life completely opposite from her own. Ethan packed lunches, repaired broken shelves, helped Lily with homework, worked double shifts without complaint, cooked simple dinners from scratch because eating out wasted money. Meanwhile, Victoria spent her days managing billion-dollar negotiations while screaming executives fought over stock prices and public image. The contrast between their worlds became impossible to ignore. Yet slowly, against her own instincts, Victoria found herself drawn toward the warmth inside Ethan's home. Lily especially became impossible to resist. The little girl asked endless questions without caring that Victoria was a billionaire CEO. Why do adults wear uncomfortable shoes? Why do rich people always look sad in magazines? Why don't you ever smile in your company photos? Nobody had spoken to Victoria so honestly in years. One snowy evening, Lily insisted Victoria join them for movie night because normal humans need breaks from laptops. Victoria almost refused automatically, but somehow ended up sitting awkwardly on the couch beneath a thick blanket while Lily fell asleep against her shoulder halfway through the film. Ethan noticed immediately. "You don't have to stay there," he said quietly. Victoria glanced down at the sleeping child. "It's fine." Ethan studied the scene silently for a second before dimming the lights lower. That tiny moment affected Victoria more than she expected. Nobody trusted her around vulnerability. Not really. People feared her, respected her, desired her influence. But trust was different. Somehow this little girl trusted her completely after only days. And somehow Ethan allowed it. One night around 2 in the morning, Victoria woke suddenly from another stress nightmare. Her breathing became uneven almost immediately. Panic attacks were rare but brutal when they came. Usually she suffered through them alone in silence. But this house was too small to hide pain. Within minutes, Ethan appeared quietly outside the guest room door. "You're breathing too fast," he said softly. Victoria immediately turned away in humiliation. "I'm fine." "No, you're not." His voice remained calm, not intrusive, just certain. Ethan stepped inside carefully and handed her a glass of water. "Slow breaths," he instructed. "Focus on something physical. The floor, the glass. Your heartbeat slowing down? Victoria hated how quickly his voice steadied her, hated how naturally he understood what to do. How do you know this works? She whispered eventually. Ethan hesitated for the first time since she'd met him. Experience. The answer carried weight far heavier than the single word itself. Victoria looked at him differently then. Not as a security guard, not even as a mystery, but as someone carrying invisible scars as deep as her own. Neither spoke for several seconds. Snow fell softly beyond the window while the house remained completely still around them. Then Ethan quietly stood to leave. Try to sleep, he said. Tomorrow will feel smaller in the morning. Victoria watched him disappear into the hallway before staring down at the untouched water in her hands. For the first time in years, someone had seen her at her weakest moment and asked for nothing in return. No advantage, no manipulation, no pity, just quiet understanding and lying awake in the darkness of that tiny guest room. Victoria found herself asking the same question over and over again. Why was a man with nothing acting more unshakable than every powerful executive she had ever known? The days that followed settled into a rhythm Victoria Hale never could have imagined herself living in. What began as a temporary inconvenience slowly transformed into something far more dangerous to her carefully controlled world familiarity. Every morning she woke to the sound of Lily humming while getting ready for school and the smell of coffee drifting through the tiny duplex kitchen. Every evening she returned from brutal meetings and endless corporate pressure to a home that somehow remained warm no matter how cold the outside world became. And worst of all, she was beginning to look forward to it. Victoria hated that realization immediately. She hated the strange comfort of hearing Ethan quietly moving around the kitchen while Lily laughed about something ridiculous at the dinner table. She hated how peaceful the house felt, compared to the sharp, polished emptiness of her penthouse life. But more than anything, she hated how impossible Ethan Brooks was becoming to understand. Because the more time she spent around him, the less he resembled an ordinary security guard. One Thursday evening, Victoria arrived home later than usual after surviving another exhausting investor call. The company's cybersecurity issues were worsening by the hour, and Damian Cross had spent the entire afternoon subtly undermining her authority in front of the board. By the time she stepped inside the duplex, tension radiated through her body like electricity. Yet the moment the front door closed behind her, something shifted. Warm light spilled from the kitchen. Old jazz music played softly in the background. Lily sat at the table coloring while Ethan stood at the stove cooking pasta with calm, effortless precision. It smelled incredible. "You're late," Lily announced dramatically. "Dad said CEOs survive entirely on caffeine and stress." Victoria loosened her coat slightly. "Your father talks too much." Ethan didn't even look up from the pan. "I actually said coffee counts as a personality trait in corporate America." Lily burst out laughing while Victoria stared at him in disbelief. Was that sarcasm? From him? Ethan finally glanced over his shoulder briefly. And for the first time since meeting him, Victoria noticed the faintest trace of amusement in his eyes. It changed his entire face. The realization unsettled her so much she immediately looked away. Dinner that night was simple. Pasta, garlic bread, cheap red wine. Ethan apologized for, even though it tasted better than bottles worth hundreds at executive events Victoria attended. Yet somehow the conversation flowed naturally around the tiny table. Lily talked about school. Ethan listened carefully while helping her solve math homework between bites. Victoria mostly stayed quiet, observing them both with growing confusion. There was no performance here, no manipulation, no hidden agenda. Just a father who genuinely adored his daughter and a child who trusted him completely. Victoria realized she had spent years surrounded by people who wanted things from each other while forgetting what genuine connection even looked like. "You're thinking too loudly again," Lily suddenly said. Victoria blinked. "Excuse me. Your face does that thing." Lily pointed directly at her forehead. "Like you're arguing with invisible people." Ethan hid a smile behind his glass. Lily, I'm helping. She defended herself proudly. Victoria almost rolled her eyes, but unexpectedly a quiet laugh escaped instead. The sound surprised everyone at the table, including her. Silence followed for half a second before Lily grinned triumphantly. See? She can smile. Ethan looked at Victoria, then not at the CEO, not at the billionaire, just at her, and for some reason that felt far more intimate than she was prepared for. Later that night, Lily fell asleep on the couch during a movie, curled against Victoria's side without hesitation. Victoria froze, at first uncertain what to do with the warm weight of a sleeping child, trusting her completely. Ethan approached quietly, carrying a blanket. "You don't have to stay there," he whispered. Victoria glanced down at Lily's peaceful face. "It's fine." Ethan covered Lily gently before sitting in the armchair across from Victoria. Rain tapped softly against the windows, while the television played quietly in the background. For several long moments, neither spoke. Then Victoria finally asked the question that had been haunting her for days. "Why aren't you intimidated by me?" Ethan leaned back slightly. "Should I be?" "Most people are. Most people confuse power with importance." The answer landed harder than Victoria expected. "And you don't." Ethan's eyes remained calm. "I think power just reveals who people already are." Victoria studied him carefully. "You speak like someone who spent time around it." Something flickered briefly across Ethan's face, gone almost instantly. "Maybe I have." There it was again. Another strange answer wrapped in mystery. Victoria suddenly became intensely aware that every conversation with Ethan felt like seeing only fragments of a much larger picture. He never lied directly, but he never truly explained himself either. Over the following week, the emotional distance between them continued shrinking in ways neither acknowledged openly. Victoria started arriving home earlier without fully understanding why. Sometimes she found Ethan helping Lily build science projects at the kitchen table. Sometimes he repaired broken appliances for neighbors who couldn't afford replacements. Once she came home during a snowstorm and discovered Ethan outside helping an elderly woman shovel her driveway after working a 12-hour shift. "You know you could charge people for this," Victoria remarked from the porch afterward. Ethan removed his gloves slowly. "Not everything needs to become a transaction." The response hit Victoria harder than it should have, because transactions were exactly how she understood the world. Money, leverage, advantage. Every relationship in her life eventually became about exchange. Yet Ethan moved through life differently, quietly, steadily, like kindness itself was simply normal to him. One evening, Victoria walked into the kitchen to find Ethan repairing Lily's old music box with careful concentration. Tiny screws and tools covered the table while Lily watched anxiously beside him. "Can you fix it?" she whispered. "Probably." "You always say probably, even when you know you can." Ethan smirked faintly. Confidence becomes arrogance faster than people realize. Victoria stood in the doorway observing him closely. His hands moved with astonishing precision. Not like a maintenance worker improvising repairs, but like someone professionally trained in delicate systems. Within minutes, the music box began playing softly again. Lily squealed and hugged him instantly. Ethan hugged her back without hesitation, eyes closing briefly as though those moments grounded him somehow. Victoria felt something unfamiliar tighten painfully in her chest. Longing, not for romance, for belonging. She suddenly realized she had spent years building an empire while never creating a single moment like this for herself. That night after Lily went to sleep, Victoria found Ethan sitting alone on the back porch despite the freezing cold. Snow drifted quietly across the dark neighborhood while city lights glowed faintly in the distance. "You'll freeze out here," she said. Ethan handed her a second mug of coffee. Without looking surprised, she joined him. "You couldn't sleep either?" he asked. Victoria wrapped both hands around the warm mug. "Too much happening at work." Ethan nodded once. Cyberattack's still getting worse. Victoria turned sharply toward him. How do you know about that security guards hear things? The answer came too quickly, too smooth. Victoria narrowed her eyes. You understood the terminology during that board call yesterday? Ethan remained calm. I understand more things than people assume. Clearly. Silence settled briefly between them. Then Victoria asked quietly, Who are you really, Ethan? For the first time since meeting him, genuine tension entered the air. Ethan stared out into the snow-covered darkness for several long seconds before answering. Just a father trying to give his daughter a quiet life. That's not the whole answer. No, he admitted softly. It isn't. Victoria waited for him to continue. He never did. The mystery surrounding him only deepened after that. Small details began haunting her constantly. Ethan spoke fluent French to a delivery driver one afternoon without warning. He repaired a complex security panel in minutes after professional technicians failed for hours. During one company emergency call, Victoria accidentally mentioned a server breach pattern, and Ethan immediately identified the likely attack source before her own cybersecurity division did. How the hell did you know that? She demanded. Ethan barely looked up from washing dishes. Lucky guess. Victoria almost laughed from frustration. Nothing about him felt accidental anymore. Meanwhile, Damian Cross became increasingly interested in Victoria's living situation. During one board meeting, he casually remarked, Interesting rumor going around headquarters. Apparently, our fearless CEO has become very attached to building security. Victoria's eyes turned ice-cold instantly. Careful, Damian. He raised his hands innocently. I'm simply saying people notice things. People should focus on fixing the company instead of gossiping. Damian smiled slightly. Of course. But Victoria knew that look. Damian was watching, investigating, and somehow that made her unexpectedly protective of Ethan and Lily, which made even less sense. One snowy Saturday morning, Lily convinced Victoria to join them at a small neighborhood winter festival. Victoria initially refused 3 times before somehow ending up walking beside them through crowded streets lined with lights and food stands. Nobody recognized her there. Nobody cared about stock markets or corporate power. She was simply another woman drinking hot chocolate beside a father and daughter laughing together beneath falling snow. At one point, Lily ran ahead toward an ice sculpture display, while Victoria and Ethan followed more slowly behind. You're good with her, Victoria admitted quietly. Ethan watched Lily carefully from a distance. She saved me more than I saved her. Victoria looked at him sharply. What does that mean? Ethan's expression darkened slightly. It means grief can destroy people if they don't have a reason to survive it. Something inside Victoria shifted at those words, because for the first time she heard genuine pain beneath his calm exterior. Deep pain. The kind that never fully leaves. Before she could ask more, Lily came running back excitedly and grabbed both their hands without thinking. The 3 of them crossed the crowded street together beneath glowing winter lights, and for one brief, dangerous moment, Victoria experienced something she had not felt in years. Peace. Real peace. But later that night, the feeling shattered. Victoria woke around 3 in the morning after hearing faint voices from Ethan's office downstairs. She stepped quietly into the hallway and stopped near the partially open door. Ethan stood inside, speaking on the phone in a tone she had never heard before. Cold. Controlled. Precise. No, he said quietly. If they've identified the breach pattern already, then containment failed weeks ago. Victoria's pulse quickened instantly. Ethan continued speaking in low, measured sentences filled with advanced cybersecurity terminology most executives wouldn't even recognize. Satellite encryption, defense architecture, counter-intrusion sequencing, none of it matched the life of a security guard. Then Ethan suddenly went silent. Slowly, almost instinctively, he turned toward the doorway. Their eyes locked. Victoria felt caught even though she wasn't sure why. Ethan ended the call immediately. Silence filled the room. 6 monitors glowed behind him, covered in encrypted data streams and attack simulations far beyond anything she'd ever seen outside government systems. Victoria stared at the screens in disbelief before looking back at him. "Who are you really?" she whispered again. This time Ethan didn't answer at all, and somehow the silence terrified her far more than the truth might have. Victoria Hale barely slept after discovering Ethan's hidden office. The image refused to leave her mind: 6 glowing monitors filled with classified-level cyber intelligence, encrypted maps tracking global intrusion patterns, security systems sophisticated enough to rival government infrastructure, and Ethan standing in the center of it all with the calm authority of someone who understood every line of code flowing across those screens. Nothing about him made sense anymore. Not the quiet duplex, not the overnight security shifts, not the worn sweaters and humble routines. Every piece of the man she thought she knew was beginning to fracture apart into something far larger and far more dangerous. The next morning, Ethan acted as though nothing had happened. He packed Lily's lunch, braided her hair after she complained her ponytail looked crooked, and reminded her twice not to forget her science project. Victoria watched him carefully from across the kitchen table, searching for signs of the man she had seen the night before. But Ethan remained calm, controlled, almost impossibly ordinary. That frustrated her more than anger would have. "You're staring again," Lily announced cheerfully while eating cereal. Victoria blinked. "I'm not. You do it when you're confused." Ethan quietly hid a smirk behind his coffee mug. Victoria narrowed her eyes at him immediately. "You think this is funny?" "No," Ethan replied calmly. "I think you're trying very hard to solve a puzzle." The answer irritated her because it was true. By noon, the situation inside Hale Dynamics exploded into full crisis. Victoria arrived at headquarters to discover emergency lockdown protocols already active across multiple floors. Employees rushed through hallways carrying laptops while security teams barked into radios. Large monitors inside the Executive Operations Center flashed alarming red warnings across every screen. Data breach escalation. Network failure detected. Global client systems compromised. Victoria's pulse sharpened instantly. Status report she demanded the moment she entered the room. One of her lead analysts looked pale. The intrusion spread faster overnight. Financial servers are being rerouted externally. Can we isolate the attack? We tried. Whoever designed this knew exactly how our architecture works. Damian Cross stepped forward immediately, his face tight with controlled panic. Investors are already pulling back. If we don't stop this within hours, we lose international contracts. Victoria stared at the collapsing system feeds with growing dread. None of this made sense. The attack patterns were too advanced, too precise. It was as though someone had spent years studying the company from the inside. Then one of the analysts enlarged a sequence map onto the main screen. Victoria froze. She recognized it immediately. It was nearly identical to the encrypted simulations she had seen inside Ethan's office. Her heart began pounding. "Run that sequence again," she ordered quietly. The analyst obeyed. Victoria's mind raced. Ethan had known. Somehow he had known this was coming before her entire executive division did. Damian noticed her expression immediately. What he asked sharply. Victoria hesitated for only half a second before making a decision she never imagined possible. "I need someone brought into this room." 20 minutes later, Ethan Brooks walked into the Executive Operations Center wearing his simple, dark security uniform, while dozens of high-level executives turned toward him in confusion. Some openly laughed under their breath. Others looked offended that a building guard had been summoned into a billion-dollar crisis meeting. Damian stared at Victoria like she had lost her mind. "You cannot be serious." Victoria ignored him completely. Her eyes stayed locked on Ethan. "Look at the attack sequence." Ethan's gaze shifted calmly toward the screens. The entire room watched in silence as his expression subtly changed. The warmth disappeared first. Then the softness. What remained was something sharp enough to cut through steel. Ethan stepped closer to the monitors without speaking. His eyes scanned lines of code with terrifying speed. "This wasn't designed to steal data," he said quietly after several seconds. The room fell silent. One analyst frowned. What Ethan pointed toward the server mapping. "The breach is only phase 1. They're testing your emergency response timing." Victoria's stomach tightened instantly, for what Ethan looked directly at her. Total infrastructure collapse. Silence crashed across the room. Even Damien stopped talking. Ethan moved toward the central keyboard before pausing. "May I?" Victoria nodded immediately. The moment Ethan touched the system, the atmosphere inside the room changed completely. His fingers moved across the keyboard with impossible precision, while streams of encrypted data flooded the screens faster than anyone could follow. One by one, hidden access points appeared across the system architecture. Entire attack pathways executives didn't even know existed were suddenly exposed within minutes. The cybersecurity team stared at him in disbelief. "How are you doing this?" someone whispered. Ethan didn't answer. He was already 10 steps ahead of everyone else in the room. "They embedded dormant triggers inside your backup servers 6 months ago," he said calmly. "Every defensive response you make activates another layer." Victoria watched him with growing shock. This was not intelligence. This was mastery. Ethan understood the system more deeply than the people who built it, more than the executives she had trusted for years, more than anyone. Damien stepped forward aggressively. "Who the hell are you?" Ethan ignored him entirely. "Shut down sectors 3 through 7 immediately. Disconnect all satellite relays. If you wait another 20 minutes, they'll spread into your international grid." "Do it," Victoria ordered instantly. Analysts scrambled into action. For the next 2 hours, Ethan completely took control of the crisis room. And nobody challenged him again. The transformation was staggering. The quiet single father who cooked pancakes and repaired sinks suddenly commanded billion-dollar cyber defense operations with terrifying authority. He anticipated attacks before they happened, predicted infiltration patterns, rebuilt collapsing firewalls in real time. At one point, an executive attempted to question his strategy, and Ethan dismantled the man's entire technical argument in less than 30 seconds without raising his voice once. Victoria stood near the back of the room watching him in stunned silence. Every instinct she possessed told her she was witnessing something extraordinary. The man she had once unconsciously viewed as invisible was operating on a level none of her elite executives could even comprehend. Then the final shock arrived. One of the older government investors watching remotely suddenly leaned toward the camera feed with visible disbelief. "Wait," the man whispered. His eyes widened slowly. "That's impossible." The entire room turned toward the screen. The investor stared directly at Ethan. Ethan Cole. Silence exploded through the operations center. Ethan stopped typing for the first time all day. Victoria looked sharply toward him. Cole Damien immediately grabbed a tablet and began searching frantically. Seconds later, his face lost all color. "Oh my God." Victoria snatched the tablet from his hands. What she saw made her blood run cold. Classified government articles, archived intelligence reports, national cybersecurity briefings, and at the center of all of them, Ethan, younger, sharper, standing beside presidents, military officials, and intelligence directors. Ethan Cole, founder of one of the most advanced cyber defense systems ever created. A man once described as the architect behind modern national digital security infrastructure. A genius who disappeared nearly a decade earlier after exposing corruption connected to private defense contractors, officially presumed dead. Victoria slowly looked up from the screen toward the quiet man standing in the center of her collapsing company. Her entire understanding of reality tilted sideways. Ethan met her gaze calmly, but exhaustion lived behind his eyes now. Deep exhaustion. the kind carried by people who had survived too much. Damien stared at him in disbelief. "You're Ethan Cole." Ethan remained silent. "You built Sentinel Shield?" Another executive whispered. "That system protects half the country's financial networks." Victoria's chest tightened painfully. Suddenly, everything made sense. The intelligence, the calm, the hidden systems inside his office, the scars she noticed on his hands, the way he looked at power like he no longer believed in it. This man had once stood at the highest level of global cybersecurity, and she had first met him while he was fixing a leaking pipe beneath a kitchen sink. Ethan finally broke the silence quietly. "The people behind this attack are connected to the same network I exposed years ago." Victoria stared at him. "You knew this was coming." "I suspected. Why didn't you tell me?" For the first time, emotion cracked through Ethan's controlled exterior. Because people around power always think they're untouchable until the walls start collapsing. The words hit Victoria harder than any accusation. Because deep down she knew he was right. Suddenly, alarms blared across the operations center again. New attack warnings flooded every screen. Panic erupted instantly among the executives. But Ethan didn't move, didn't panic, didn't even raise his voice. He simply stepped forward once more. Eyes fixed on the collapsing systems around him like a soldier returning to a battlefield he had hoped never to see again. And standing there, surrounded by frightened executives and billion-dollar chaos, Victoria Hale realized something that changed her forever. The most extraordinary man in the entire room was the one everyone had spent weeks looking down on. The cyberattack was stopped just before dawn. By the time the sun finally rose over Chicago, Hale Dynamics had survived the worst corporate crisis in its history, and every executive inside the building knew exactly who had saved them. News about Ethan Cole spread across the country within hours. Media stations called him a vanished genius. Government officials tried contacting him again. Investors suddenly treated him like the most valuable man in the industry. But Ethan wanted none of it. The attention in his eyes looked less like victory and more like exhaustion. After years of hiding from the world, he had been dragged back into it once again. Damien Cross was quietly removed from the company after internal investigations exposed his corruption and secret involvement with the compromised contractors. Yet Ethan never celebrated his downfall. He never mocked him, never sought revenge. That confused Victoria more than anything else. "After everything they did to you," she asked one evening, "why don't you hate them?" Ethan stood quietly at the kitchen sink washing dishes while snow drifted softly outside the window. "Because hate keeps people trapped in the worst moment of their lives," he answered calmly. "Lily deserves a father who knows how to move forward." Victoria lowered her eyes after that because she suddenly realized Ethan had spent years carrying pain without allowing it to poison who he was. And for the first time in her life, she began questioning the person she herself had become. Weeks passed. Victoria no longer returned to the penthouse even after repairs finished. Somehow the quiet duplex had become the only place that truly felt safe. The cold, ambitious CEO who once judged people through titles and status slowly changed without noticing it herself. She began listening more carefully during meetings, treating employees differently, remembering names. One afternoon, she publicly thanked the overnight cleaning staff during a company gathering, and the entire executive floor looked stunned. But Victoria no longer cared about appearances the way she once had. Because Ethan had unknowingly shown her something humiliating and beautiful, at the same time the strongest people in the world were often the ones nobody bothered to truly see. One night, Victoria found Ethan sitting alone on the back porch after Lily had fallen asleep. The city lights shimmered faintly beyond the snow-covered rooftops, while silence wrapped gently around them. Victoria sat beside him without speaking for several moments. "You're still thinking about leaving," she said quietly. Ethan didn't deny it. "My life tends to destroy peaceful things eventually." Victoria turned toward him slowly. "You didn't destroy this place." Ethan looked down at his hands. "You don't know everything about my past." "Maybe not," she admitted softly. "But I know who you are now." Ethan finally looked at her then, and for the first time since she met him, the guarded distance in his eyes weakened completely. Victoria reached for his hand carefully, almost as if afraid he might disappear. "You were the first person who ever looked at me like I was just human," she whispered. "Not powerful, not useful, just human." Ethan's fingers tightened around hers slowly. No grand confession followed, no dramatic promises. Just two lonely people sitting together beneath the winter sky, finally allowing themselves to stop surviving long enough to feel something real again. Months later, the small duplex kitchen remained warm with morning light and Lily's endless chatter. Ethan now led Hale Dynamics' ethical cybersecurity division, but he still made pancakes every Sunday morning and walked Lily to school whenever he could. Victoria still ran the company, but she no longer ruled it through fear alone. And somewhere between quiet dinners, late-night conversations, and the healing warmth of a family she never expected to find, the cold loneliness that once defined her life slowly disappeared. Because in the end, the man she once saw as invisible became the one person who finally taught her how to truly see.